The T-34 medium tank was one of the technological wonders of the Second World War. Designed, built and used in Russia, the T-34 stunned the invading German army and prevented it from seizing Moscow. The Third Reich even tried to clone the T-34, but its attempts never challenged the supremacy of the Soviet colossus. Yet the story of the T-34 is a truly remarkable one. Unlike its Western counterparts, the T-34 did not emerge from a long tradition of tank development. It was the result of overnight industrialization at tremendous human cost. The T-34 was Stalin's way of showing the world that Russia could outgun, outproduce and overwhelm the industrial West.
It was a very, very good tank. When the Germans met it, they were amazed.
The T-34 symbolized the Russian fight for industrial supremacy with the capitalist West. Not only was the T-34 the best all-round tank by 1941, but it retained this dominance until the end of the war. But the T-34 was also the product of a strong military. By 1945, the Red Army was the most effective force in the world at conducting large-scale armored operations. Yet the T-34 and the Red Army could not have emerged from more unlikely beginnings.
The First World War had been fought in a very, very backward way, and in fact Russia lost that war partly because it was so backward. The Civil War, which was fought between 1917 and 1920, was even more backward than the First World War was. It was largely a war fought by cavalry. But it did establish in Russia a tradition of using cavalry for independent operations, what might be called later on deep operations.
The Revolution and Civil War convinced the Bolsheviks that they would need a military arm to stay in power. So in 1918, the Red Army was born.
The Russian Civil War is critical in understanding the creation of the modern Red Army. Obviously, with the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, there was then, following on from that, the Russian Civil War, which took place between 1919 and really 1921. And Russia really was facing forces both from Japan and also from America and Britain, and also internal opposition from the so-called white forces. Now, the Russian Bolshevik forces did not perform particularly well, and under pressure in relation to this, Leon Trotsky, who was the sort of father of the modern Russian army, brought back 48,000 Tsarist officers, and also senior NCOs were also brought back to try and resurrect the professionalism of the Russian army. So in that sense, the Civil War is very important in understanding the professionalism that takes place within the Russian army.
In the early 1920s, the fledgling communist government decided its priorities for the years ahead, but it had many questions to answer.
When the Russians then start thinking about what shape a future war might take and what assets they might need to wage war, armour is something that they think about, because the huge expanse of Russia means that if you have something that can move fast, can move across country, and can deal death and destruction out at very long distances from the base, this is obviously something that you want in that sort of country.
But to predict the nature of future warfare meant studying how the West had waged war in the past. So Russian generals analysed World War I and used their findings to formulate a plan to beat a capitalist coalition. They called their plan Deep Battle.
The traditional Russian offensive was to advance on a mass front using mass infantry tactics. And the idea of the deep battle was in a sense to try and marry the whole concept of mechanised warfare using armour, lorried infantry, mobile artillery, and is still advancing on a large front, advancing perhaps up to 100 kilometres in terms of the actual width of the advance, perhaps up to a depth of 50 kilometres, maybe even more. So a kind of, almost if you like, marrying of those two concepts, this idea of the sort of mass infantry assault over a broad front, but combining that now with mechanisation.
Now, this really is the Russian equivalent of blitzkrieg. It's all about combined arms operating together to produce shock on the battlefield deep inside enemy-held territory.
The only problem with the concept of deep battle was that it required fast and heavy tanks in vast quantities. Russia's industrial base was not nearly large enough to produce the volume of weapons and vehicles to make deep battle a reality. That, however, was about to change. In 1927, the communist leader Stalin launched a ruthless breakneck program of industrialization and economic modernization called the 5-Year Plan. It proved remarkably successful in establishing heavy industry in just a few years, despite the enormous human cost of meeting Stalin's deadlines. In 1931, a massive tank-building program was launched. Russia was finally on its way to catching up with the industrial West. By the early 1930s, Russia had undergone a radical transformation. Determined to shake off its image as a rural backwater, in the late 1920s, Stalin had launched a ruthless program of industrialization to bring it on a par with the West. By 1931, enough factories were in place to start tank production.
When the Russians begin thinking about how they can actually put a mechanized army into effect, they think of different kinds of tanks. Tanks that can cooperate closely with the infantry, tanks that can operate in the kind of general area of the front line, and tanks that can exploit, which can go deep into the rear of the enemy's forces. The British have a similar concept with the idea of infantry tanks and cruiser tanks, and the infantry tanks attack the front line, the cruiser tanks exploit. The Russians do that as well, and they develop a kind of family of tanks. There are 4 of them in the course of the 1930s. They have a tankette, which is a British design. They buy a Vickers design off the shelf. They have a light tank, which is the T-34, which is another Vickers design brought off the shelf. And that's the tank which cooperates with the infantry. But to exploit the breakthrough, they develop this cruiser tank, and that tank is the BT.
The BT started life in 1930, when Russia bought 2 Christie tanks from the United States.
The BT was a clever bit of Russian stealing Western technology. It was a private venture developed in America by the Christie Corporation. It was really more of an armoured car than a tank, but it was armoured, it did have tracks, and it did have machine guns on it. Now, it didn't do terribly well in American trials, and indeed the Americans really never accepted the Christie suspension, although other countries did. But the Russians were interested in it, and the Russians bought 2 and had them shipped out to Russia. Now, because the Americans did not recognise the USSR, this had to be done clandestinely, and in fact they were brought out ostensibly as tractors. And then developed in Russia.
In many respects, the BT tank finally gave the Russians what they'd been looking for, or at least what certain factions within the Russian armoured forces had been looking for. It was the perfect weapon for the kind of deep manoeuvre. It was fast, it was very, very mobile. It could strike deep very, very, very quickly, and it could strike hard. This was a superb weapon for the Russians, and they recognised it as such when they saw Christie's design. And they took Christie's design, and instead of overly elaborating it as the British did, they kept true to its fundamental principles. The BT series itself was very little different from the Christie design. It deviated in only a small respect, and was gradually and incrementally up-armoured and up-armed. And really it became the design foundation for all subsequent Soviet tanks in most respects.
Designers at the Kharkov locomotive plant worked on the Christie design and came up with the BT-7 tank. It was one of the seminal designs of the 1930s. The BT-7 was the forerunner to the T-34. It had a 3-man crew. It mounted a 45mm gun and 2 7.62mm machine guns. Its armour was up to 22mm thick. It was powered by a V12 aero engine that was capable of 500 brake horsepower, a range of 430 kilometres, and a top road speed of 73 kilometres per hour. By 1937, Russia had undergone a huge transformation. Its enormous factories were outproducing those of the West. The Red Army had the largest armoured force in the world. It was equipped with the best tank of its generation and had a sophisticated doctrine of manoeuvre warfare. Stalin had made his point.
I think it's the idea of competition with the West, and gigantomania is very important. The idea that we have the biggest and the fastest and the most powerful kind of equipment is very important to the Russian state, not only in terms of military equipment, but for all other kinds of manufactured goods as well. In a way, one of the reasons why tanks work better than aircraft is you can build very heavy tanks. Heavy aircraft are kind of a not particularly good idea, whereas tanks can be built with very heavy armor, with very heavy guns. And they can make the kind of point which the government wants to make. So, yes, I think it's important that the Russians do make tanks with larger guns than anybody else, tanks with heavier armor than anybody else, tanks that weigh more than anyone else's tanks, because it's part of this sense of proving that Russia has socialized and is now catching up with and overtaking the developed economies of the West.
But this massive advantage was turned upside down when Stalin suspected that key figures within the army were planning a coup. Unable to tolerate even a hint of dissent, his response was swift and brutal. In what later became known as the Purges, Stalin ordered that anyone suspected of disloyalty be killed or disappeared.
3 of the 5 marshals of the Soviet Union are made to disappear. And of the corps commanders, these are lieutenant generals and generals, 75 out of 85 of those senior officers are eliminated in really effectively 12 to 18 months. At a divisional level, over half of the divisional commanders are also essentially killed or, in some cases, placed in gulags.
By taking out so many commanders at all levels, the standards of training, the professional standards of the Russian army inevitably declined, and the willingness of Russian commanders at all levels to use their initiative virtually stopped. Everybody was frightened of doing anything that might upset the party.
The Purges coincided with Soviet participation in the Spanish Civil War, when Stalin sent a number of T-26 and BT tanks to help the Republicans. The experience of operating tanks in Spain convinced Soviet commanders that they were too thinly armoured. But the armour wasn't their only concern. Much of their work revolved around the BT's use of tracks and wheels.
It had an interesting concept in that they had tracks and wheels. Now, this sounds odd now, but at that stage, when the track technology had not been fully developed, it did make sense to approach the battle on a road on your wheels, and then, in a space of about 30 minutes, you could transfer it onto tracks.
The wheel-track debate abruptly ended in the winter of 1939, when the Soviet Union invaded Finland. In the face of fierce Finnish resistance, it became clear that the current generation of tanks was not sufficiently armoured or armed. But designers were sure that the tracked version of the BT could be up-armoured and up-gunned without any drop in performance. This new improved version of the BT was called T-34 to commemorate the 1934 state decree ordering a massive expansion in Soviet tank forces. 2 prototypes were ready by January 1940. Mass production began in June, and the first T-34 model emerged in September 1940. The T-34 was one of the most outstanding tanks of the Second World War. It was manned by a crew of 5. It mounted a 76.2mm gun with 2 7.62mm machine guns. Its V2 diesel engine was capable of 493 brake horsepower, a range of 300 kilometers, and a top road speed of 50 kilometers per hour.
Certainly at the time there was nothing like it anywhere in the world to compare with the Russian T-34. It was just, everybody was astonished how they could turn something out. It was just perfect. If you build a tank, you always have to compromise the weight, the speed, the armor. One thing interferes with the other. So the whole thing has to be a compromise between all those factors.
The T-34 made its battlefield debut in June 1941, when Hitler tore up his non-aggression pact with Stalin and brought the war to Russia. In what was codenamed Operation Barbarossa, a German army of 3 million men crossed the Soviet border. The army divided into 3 groups: Army Group North, Army Group Center, and Army Group South. Army Group North was detailed to take Leningrad. Army Group Center was ordered to march on Moscow. And the task of Army Group South was to conquer the Ukraine. On paper, Russia's armored resources looked formidable, with 21,000 tanks, compared to the Germans' mere 3,300. But nothing could have prepared the German army for the T-34. After a string of victories in Europe, German soldiers were used to crushing opposition tanks easily. The T-34's effect was utterly devastating. Otto Benze was an infantryman with Army Group North.
Haben wir erlebt. Bei Stare hier, da wurden allerdings viele russische Panzer wurden tatsächlich von unserer PAK, das ist die Panzerabwehrkanonen, hatten wir da bei uns in den Stellungen mit, bei der Infanterie. Die hatten 7,5 cm, war das Geschütz, ein Langrohr, und die haben die Panzer knacken können. Sonst konnte man den Panzer konnte man ja nichts machen gegen Panzer. Die waren ja so gesichert, also so fabriziert. Das war der russische T-34, das war der beste Panzer, den der Russe hatte.
The German infantry found, to its horror, that the T-34 was virtually shell-proof. The reason for this was simple, but incredibly effective: sloping armor.
One of the major strengths of the T-34 is sloping armor, something which every nation has copied. Now, the point about sloping armor is you get increased protection for the same weight. It's a simple concept, but it was the Russians who thought of it first.
It had thick armour, and it had a decent gun in the 76mm. And when the Germans met this for the first time, it outclassed everything they had. The 37mm could make no impression on it, as could the new 50mm, had enough problems. It was only an in-placed 88 that could deal with it. And against a weapon like the 76mm, the 88mm gun was, in actual fact, quite vulnerable in itself. It was a large tower engaged at similar ranges, if you consider the type of countryside that some of the engagements would have taken place in. So it was a pretty attritional match between the T-34s and the 88s. So, it was an enormous shock to the Germans, and they needed to do something about it very, very quickly.
Armed with Panzer IIIs and IVs, horrified German tank crews found they were simply unable to pierce the T-34's sloping armor.
Oder noch schwächer, vielleicht mal eine 7,5 dabei. Sie nannten diese Geschütze Panzeranklopfgeräte, weil wir waren panzermäßig den Russen unterlegen. Die hatten mit ihrem legendären T-34 eine ganz andere Panzerwaffe.
Yet the Soviets faced some serious problems at the beginning of Operation Barbarossa. They had the excellent T-34, but there were too few of them, and they were not concentrated in battle. The odd T-34 did pose some tactical problems for Hitler's army, but superior German training and doctrine almost outweighed this advantage. In 1941, the Soviets paid a heavy price for Stalin's purges. Those soldiers left in the Red Army had no battlefield experience and lacked adequate training. It became standard practice for men to go into battle after just 1 hour in a tank.
You need at least 6 years training to do your job properly. But Stalin, he done away with hundreds and hundreds of high-ranking officers. I believe most of the generals, the army commanders, the lot. The so-called purges of Stalin in Russia at the time took the lives of about 35,000 officers and generals. All shot without any sort of court case out of hand. And of course this disrupted the whole Russian build-up of their own forces, which, after all, were only then starting after the Civil War. And Russia found itself in a very difficult situation.
Firstly, there is a lack of crew training. Crews have been rushed in from the infantry and from the cavalry with minimal training. Junior officers have also not had sufficient training or courses, and therefore at that level the crews are really learning on the job. There's also in the early T-34 design a very sort of poor vision arrangement, in the sense that tank crews find it very difficult to see properly, and that's going to affect the operational effectiveness of this vehicle, particularly in the turret.
Communication in the Red Army was appalling. Many soldiers were illiterate, and there was a chronic shortage of radios, making command and control nearly impossible.
Every German tank had a radio. Every American tank had a radio. In 1941, command tanks in the Red Army had radios, and the rest didn't. And the way in which a troop commander told the other tanks what to do was to wave signal flags at them, which is not a very good idea in the middle of a tank battle, or simply follow me. The other tanks followed the lead tank. So the idea of sophisticated tactics was very difficult if communications weren't very good.
By October, Army Group Center was just 25 kilometers from Moscow. But as the weather deteriorated, the German tanks' tracks became clogged with mud and later struggled in the snow. The T-34, with its Christie suspension, wide tracks and low ground pressure, remained mobile. Again, Soviet designers used simple designs to great effect.
They had one terribly simple little idea. One of the problems you always have with tanks is the track pins. Now, the track pin is literally a steel pin that holds the different sectors of track together. And one of the problems is that they sometimes come out. And it's quite difficult in an engineering sense to make the thing stay in. What the Russians did was they put a curved plate on the inside of the track, so that any track pin was halfway out. As the track came round, the curved plate just pushed it back into position again.
As the winter started to slow the German army, Russian troops enjoyed the advantages of a tank built to withstand the harsh weather. Its V2 engine ran on diesel that froze at a lower temperature than the petrol used by the Germans. There was no need to light fires under the T-34 to get its engine to start.
The temperatures dropped to minus 56 degrees. The Germans, not prepared for any sort of winter war, were caught absolutely unawares. Their weapons wouldn't work anymore because they didn't have any anti-frost liquid. They didn't have any anti-frost grease to keep the guns going. Everything just got stuck under the enormous ice cover and snow cover you got in Russia before Moscow.
The T-34 was well adapted for winter conditions, particularly the tracks. It had very broad tracks compared with other vehicles of the period. The Germans, in order to cope with the snow, had to fit enlarged track shoes on the outside of the tracks, which were not a terribly effective way. They broke off quite easily. The T-34, as it was, could run quite easily on snow. The Christie suspension didn't pack with snow and ice as easily as the German multi-wheel, multi-bogie levered suspensions did, which were quite vulnerable to this. Also, the engine ran extremely well in the cold. It was a very, very good engine from that point of view. And the Germans simply had far more trouble maintaining their tanks in that kind of performance. Obviously, the T-34 had been designed for the terrain in which it operated. It had been designed to operate in Russia. It had been built with Russian experience in mind. The basic norms of everyday conditions in Russia were at the back of everything that they did. The Germans, likewise, the norms of everyday conditions and infrastructure in Germany determined the way the Germans built their tanks, and really, you know, the Eastern Front was not Germany.
Although the harsh winter was slowing the German advance, time was rapidly running out for the Soviets. It started to look like there would be no quick German victory, but a long, drawn-out battle of attrition, where sheer numbers would account for as much as tactical genius. After suffering catastrophic losses in 1941, pressure was on the Red Army to retrain and re-equip by the spring of 1942. The only way the Soviet Union was going to beat the Axis would be with the help of many, many more T-34s. But there was a problem. Most of Russia's heavy industry was in the path of the German onslaught. Leningrad was a center for heavy tank production and had already become encircled by the German army. So, in late 1941, Stalin thought the unthinkable and took the unprecedented step of relocating the Soviet armaments industry eastwards to the Urals, Volga, eastern Siberia, and Central Asia. Factories were reassembled in appalling conditions, similar to those endured under the 5-year plan. But the sheer scale of the relocation was something not seen before.
This movement of industrial plant in particular was at least partially successful. It wasn't wholly successful, but it is a matter of historical record that something like 2,500 factories were moved from somewhere like, in terms of a geographical equivalent, the south of England, and rebuilt as somewhere as far away as Iceland, and that was achieved with really minimal disruption to industrial production. In terms of tank production and artillery production, we see ongoing increases, steady increases in Soviet production figures during 1942, 43 and 44.
As the T-34 outclassed German tanks by such a huge margin, the Soviets did not have to spend time developing new models. And while the Germans struggled to develop a match for the T-34, the Soviets could concentrate on production. That is, until German designers finally did come up with an answer. German High Command did not expect a long, drawn-out struggle when it ordered the invasion of Russia in 1941. It did not think the Russians capable of producing a battle-worthy tank, and a string of victories in Europe merely strengthened Hitler's belief in the Third Reich's invincibility. When Barbarossa started, there was no intention to replace the Panzer IV, the workhorse of the German tank arm. However, the T-34 had shattered the myth of Soviet inferiority, and the Germans desperately needed a new tank that could match, if not beat, the T-34. Although it wasn't politically acceptable to be seen to copy the T-34, that is in fact what the Germans did. Their answer was the Panzer Mark V, named the Panther, which owed much to the T-34. Its excellent 75mm gun and thick sloped armour made the new tank a particularly dangerous adversary. The Germans waited until the summer of 1943 before they unleashed their new weapon.
Between June of 41 and the summer of 43, the Germans make every attempt to match the Russians in terms of quality, if not of quantity. So they're trying to have tanks that are as good as the T-34 and the KV. So they build the Tiger to really have the same kind of armor as the KV, and with a gun that can penetrate the armor of either the T-34 or the KV. It's an 88mm high-velocity gun. It's ideal for knocking out other tanks. They develop another tank which is, in effect, kind of not really a clone of the T-34, but is designed to have the same kind of attributes as the T-34. It has sloped armor, it's got a heavy gun, a 75mm gun, and that's the Panther. So the Panther is, if you like, the German version of the T-34. It's much heavier. In fact, the Panther is the same size as the KV. It's really quite a big tank, but technically it's as good or better than the T-34.
After defeating the Germans at Stalingrad during the winter of 1942-43, a huge salient in the line, 160 kilometers wide and 110 kilometers deep, centered on the city of Kursk. Ignoring advice from his generals urging a temporary shift to the defensive, Hitler decided that his army should regain the initiative by crushing the Kursk salient. But a member of Hitler's entourage had tipped off the Russians, who already suspected that an attack would be launched around Kursk. So the Red Army transformed the bulge into a huge fortress, where the German army would be channeled into Soviet fields of fire by carefully placed minefields. When all the preparations were finished, 1,336,000 Russian soldiers, and 3,444 tanks, most of them T-34s, sat in or behind 8 defensive belts, stretching back 175 kilometres. Although the Germans only fielded 900,000 men and 2,700 armoured vehicles to do the job, they were confident their new heavy Tiger tanks and medium Panthers would cancel out the Soviet advantage in numbers. But at Kursk, the German army would be dogged by the same problems that had hampered the Red Army in 1941: lack of crew training.
Hitler wouldn't wait. He waited for his new tanks, which of course came just off the production line. Not even the crews were trained properly, and the tanks weren't tried out. As the tanks arrived for his big battle, they broke down on the way, especially the new Panzer, which only just after 15 months' work on it had taken the road. It broke down left, right and center, you see, because it was untied. Usually the exhaust systems overheated and set the whole exhaust system, fuel collected in there, sometimes set it on fire, and the tanks burned out even, or exploded. So he lost quite a few of his 200 tanks. And then he also had the Tiger, of course. But the Tiger was a bit more reliable because it had been tried earlier. But still, it was an unknown quantity, especially to the crews. They weren't properly trained on them.
The German offensive began on the 5th of July and was met by remarkably stiff resistance. The depth of Soviet defences meant that the Germans failed to make the inroads that they'd expected. But at Kursk, the Red Army discovered that the T-34 no longer had the edge in tank-to-tank combat.
It's curious that there are really better tanks on the German side at Kursk, but because the Russians have the numbers and because they also have a better system, now they can operate tanks in large groups, they can communicate, they have skilled commanders, they have skilled division and corps leaders. They can actually win a major battle in the summertime against the Wehrmacht. That's why the battle is important, because at Moscow in 1941, at Stalingrad in 1942, the battle is really fought in the winter. It's a kind of infantry battle. It isn't really about tank warfare, but Kursk is. And in 1943, the Russians in effect win that battle because at the Battle of Kursk and the Battle of Ariel right afterwards, they drive the Germans back. So they actually can fight an effective tank battle under modern conditions, and that's the coming of age of the Red Army.
The main problem lay in the inability of the T-34's 76.2mm gun to penetrate the frontal armour of the Panther and Tiger at anything but dangerously close range. Essentially, the T-34 needed a bigger gun. So in August 1943, work began on making the necessary improvements to keep the T-34 a viable combat vehicle. After the changes were made, the new tank entered production in January 1944. The tank that emerged was called the T-34-85. It had a 5-man crew. It got its name from its larger 85mm gun. It also mounted 2 7.62mm machine guns. With armour up to 90mm thick, it was powered by the trusted V2 engine that was capable of 500 brake horsepower and a range of 300 kilometres. It could hit a top road speed of 50 kilometres per hour.
The T-34-85 is essentially the T-34 with all its faults ironed out. It's got a turret that is much better than the previous one. 3 men can now work perfectly comfortably in the turret. It's got rid of things like the shell trap. It's got a better gun, and it's up-armoured. Despite that, it's still almost as fast as the T-34. When it comes out, it's the most powerful Allied tank anywhere, and indeed came as a bit of a shock to the Allies in 1945.
The new 85mm gun was effective up to at least 1,000 metres and could penetrate the frontal armour of the Tiger and Panther. One of the advantages of the T-34-85 was that it didn't involve a long and complicated design process that had dictated production of the German Panther. Another bonus was that it could be produced using the same production line as the T-34-76. It was soon being produced in as vast a quantity as its predecessor. In 1944, 11,000 T-34-85s were built, 2.5 times that of its German rival, the Panther. The T-34-85 entered service with the 1st Guards Tank Army and was welcomed by crews as a tank that could hold its own amongst the Tigers and Panthers. When offensive operations restarted in 1944, the improved Soviet operational skill, the better trained generation of tankmen, and powerful new vehicles inflicted a series of telling blows on the Germans. Under Operation Bagration in June 1944, Soviet infantry and heavy tanks battered a path through German lines, which was exploited by the more nimble and reliable T-34. By late July, Soviet tanks had reached the Vistula and the gates of Warsaw. Bagration showed how far the Red Army had come in terms of leadership, combat ability, and equipment. It was one of the most sustained and sophisticated operations of the war. The efforts of the summer stretched the Soviet logistical chain to the limit, and large-scale operations were not resumed until January 1945. But by the 16th of April 1945, the Red Army had reached the outskirts of Berlin. A mixture of German regular troops, old men, and Hitler Youth fought for every street, house, and room. The close range of combat and limited room for maneuver made the T-34s and other Soviet armoured vehicles extremely vulnerable to the defenders armed with Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons, mines, and Molotov cocktails. More than 800 Soviet tanks were lost in the bitter fighting. But despite fanatical German resistance, the Red Army captured the Reichstag on the 30th of April. Hitler shot himself that same day. The city surrendered on the 2nd of May, and all German forces finally surrendered on the 7th. The Soviets managed to strike a perfect balance between the need for firepower, mobility, and protection in the T-34. It was a technological hybrid of the world's most cutting-edge designs. For Stalin, it was the symbol of Mother Russia's iron will to overwhelm the capitalist West, both industrially and militarily. Yet, curiously, it retained a feature that symbolizes capitalism itself.
One rather amusing aspect of the T-34's performance, which is perhaps visible in the vehicle behind, which certainly appealed to the German sense of humour, was the fact that the hatches on the T-34, when opened on the 85, looked like Mickey Mouse's ears, which was quite ironic given the iconic status of Mickey Mouse within the capitalist world and the iconic status of the T-34 in the communist world. Quite an amusing contrast.
Stalin knew that the only way to beat the Third Reich was to keep producing the T-34 in vast numbers. He also knew that in order to keep Russia's factories ticking over, tanks had to be simply designed. And it was the T-34's simplicity that drove the Nazi army out of Russia. Its design remained virtually unchanged throughout the war. It could outgun most German tanks. It was fast, well protected, and easy to maintain. German designers copied the T-34, but their attempts failed catastrophically. The product of a proud industrial colossus, the T-34 was instrumental in crushing the German army and has rightly earned its place as one of the greatest tanks of the 20th century.
The T-34 is not the best tank of the war in terms of engineering, in terms of performance, but it's the best all-round tank of the war. It's deliberately designed to be able to be mass-produced in huge quantities. The Russians turned out something like 55,000 T-34s and their variants during the war. It was easy to operate. It could be operated by essentially a peasant army. It had parts that were interchangeable with all sorts of other tanks. If you needed a spare engine, you could get it from a KV. If you needed various other bits and pieces, you could take it from other vehicles. The T-34 wasn't the best tank of the war, but in terms of what it did, in terms of what it achieved, it was the most effective tank of the war.